What's up, guys? How y'all doing, man? Welcome to NFL Marc Draft. Hope y'all having a wonderful Monday so far today, man. And we are just right around the corner from the NFL Draft, believe it or not. I know it's still in 4 months, but really, once the season ends, or if you are a fan of a team that season has already ended, immediately, I know for me, I start thinking about draft, and I love to dive in a lot of these players. And one of my favorite things about the NFL Draft is not just looking at the prospects and their talents and what they're good at, but it's really all about the fit. Something that's so overlooked when looking at different draft grades is you can take a really good player, but if it's not going to be a good fit, which happens way more often than you think, then it ends up naturally being a bad pick. And it's unfortunate for the prospect as well, a lot of the times, right? You see this so much with quarterback. You see a lot of times like quarterback, for example, Cam Ward. I think Cam Ward was very deserving of being the number one overall pick last year. I think he's very talented. I think he showed a lot of really good stuff in his rookie season. But Tennessee better get their next head coach right. And they better have some continuity for years to come, because you see it so often where they're constantly enduring change and a culture change. And then eventually they get to the point where maybe their confidence is shot, or they're just not developing at the rate in which they're expected to, being the number one overall pick, because they are just being constantly put in different positions. That's always the most important thing. So this head coaching search now with a lot of these different teams, right? We have about 6, I think, NFL head coaching vacancies as it stands right now. Let me double check that. But it's so important for a lot of these guys. And obviously, naturally, these guys are going to be, these teams are typically going to be drafting at the upper end of the draft. But let's kind of go through them one by one and talk about it, right? Because I think that there's quite a bit that we have to look and dive into. So in terms of the current NFL landscape, the head coach openings right now, and let's go ahead and I'll share my screen and we'll talk about this, obviously, per the guy Adam Schefter, right? So right now, the biggest head coaching searches are the Giants, the Titans, the Falcons, the Cardinals, the Browns, and the Raiders, right? And you think to yourself, all right, well, is there anything that these guys, these franchises could have done in the draft that maybe would have changed them ultimately needing to move on from their head coach? Well, I'll tell you one, the Raiders, right? Yes, Pete Carroll was bad. He might be washed. He really might be. But drafting Ashton Genty at 6 was a massive mistake. It was something that we had talked about and said last year, right? I think Ashton Genty's legit. I think he's a really good player. I think he's one of the best running back prospects that I ever watched. But running back is a player-dependent position. You're dependent on a lot of different things. Obviously, your run scheme, but mainly your offensive line, the other skill position players. Is your quarterback even a threat? And he was drafted into arguably the worst possible place. The Raiders were terrible at run blocking. They were the league's worst heading into the draft, and they didn't do a whole lot to get better. I think they just had this belief that magically Pete Carroll was going to be able to make it better, and that was obviously not going to work out. And so, whereas, you look at him, and if he would have gone anywhere else to other teams, he could have easily been Rookie of the Year and had a potentially historic year overall, looking at it. And then you look at another team like the Browns, right? They've spent the last few years accumulating draft picks. I really felt like, man, from a standpoint of the type of game plan that they had, the philosophy that they had going into the draft was smart, but they wanted to skip over the quarterback entirely. They took a quarterback in the 3rd round. Dylan Gabriel was a terrible pick. Drafting a quarterback in the 3rd round is terrible. And then they ended up settling for Shador as he dropped in the draft. And it made the 3rd round pick of Dylan Gabriel even worse, because now you're bringing in a little bit more of a circus. You're bringing in a guy that's arguably more talented. Everyone had higher on their draft boards than Dylan Gabriel late. So you're basically setting both guys up for to fail in that sense. And they got a lot of other good players, right? I thought Quinshon Judkins was really solid. I didn't understand the Dylan Sampson pick. Carson Schwessinger, I think they nailed it. But they weren't able to really, if you don't have a quarterback and you don't have a good plan there, you've got nothing. Period. That's just kind of the end of it. And they decided they wanted to go in there with Joe Flacco, and then it ended up trading Joe Flacco and then with Dylan Gabriel. And it was just a mess. And those kinds of things lead to just inept organizations, inept franchises. I don't really think there's anything that can save the Browns at this point. They just kind of seem cursed, right? Cardinals, same thing. They decided to put all their chips in one basket. They drafted Marvin Harrison Jr., who a lot of people wouldn't say was a bad pick, but it's a bad pick when you have a terrible offense. Offensive scheme was bad. Offensive coordinator, play calling, not good. And the quarterback was terrible. Him and Kyler could never get on the same page. So now you've wasted essentially 2 years of a premium draft pick and a premium player. The Falcons, they're a little bit unique, right? I thought the Falcons have actually done a really good job of drafting recently. I thought Michael Penix is something that made sense for him. Him tearing his ACL for the third time really stinks, but that's kind of the risk that they endured. Obviously, Bijan Robinson has turned out to be really wonderful for him. Drake London's been a really great player. They drafted some guys on defense this last year, but gave up the first-round pick to do so, and it didn't really pay off the dividends. So there's that. The Titans and the Giants, I wouldn't say was much of a drafting issue than it was just roster management overall. But let's take a look at all of these guys individually, right? I appreciate you guys tuning in. It's my first draft video that I've made. Follow me on Marquee Sports. If you like Denver Broncos content, you like to follow the Broncos. That's my main channel. I'll put the link down below in the description. But let's talk about the draft this year. This year, I haven't really dug into the draft very deeply. I'm on the initial stages of it. But when you look at the way in which the top half of the draft is looking like, right? Because we have the draft order, it is set up until the playoff teams at the Panthers at 19. So picks 1 through 18, we know are going to be, we know who those guys are going to be. So let's do a first round mock for all the teams, and we'll kind of walk through my thoughts, in my opinion, at least very, very initial, of what's the best way to go about this draft for teams. So listen, the Raiders and the Jets are pick 1 and pick 2. There is no doubt about it that this should be quarterback, because no matter what any of these teams do, doesn't really matter if they don't have an answer at quarterback. Now, things can change. It doesn't necessarily have to be in the draft, right? I think Malik Willis is a free agent that is going to garner a lot of buzz. I think he deserves another opportunity to be a quarterback somewhere. Maybe the Raiders are that place, depending on who they end up hiring as their head coach. And maybe the Jets could do that as well. But we're going to assume that none of those happens. You've got to go quarterbacks here. You have to. You got to address it and do what it is that you can to get quarterback. But you also have a big need at quarterback in Arizona as well. So even though right now you look at the quarterbacks that are all available, right? Fernando Mendoza, who I think right now initially is the consensus best one. Dante Moore, I don't know if he's officially declared, but he's someone that's been high on everyone's list. And reports are that Ty Sampson is going to be someone that declares as well. So what are they going to do? Are all three guys going to go quarterback, or is one of them going to try to have a legitimate bridge QB and then maybe dig into it next year? It's going to be all about the philosophy. I think that the quarterback, the head coach that each of these teams hire is going to be massively important in that regard. So we're going to have to see there. But then let's talk about the Titans at 4, right? Cam Ward is their franchise quarterback. I think he's shown enough to make them feel like you can build around him. He's got to have a good head coach, a good play caller, a good scheme around him. And the best ways that you can help out a young quarterback is going to be protecting him in the O-line or fortifying the defense and giving him a really good defense that he can play with. As a Bronco fan, I look at it as an example. Bo Nix is the perfect example, right? The reason that it was such a good fit and he was able to be set up for success up to this point in his career is because he has a head coach that believes in him. That's an elite play caller that knows how to develop quarterbacks. But most importantly, he has an elite offensive line in front of him. His skill position players, that's another topic. I think you can definitely upgrade at a lot of different areas there, specifically at tight end and wide receiver and also running back. You can really look to upgrade all of those. But because he's got such a good offensive line, it helps with being able to maximize his potential and what it is that he's got. He also has a very good defense. That's very helpful, right? So that's going to be the best way to be able to do it. So if you're Tennessee, man, you got to look at some of the best players in the draft overall, right? Whether it's linebacker Arvell Reese, safety Caleb Downs, You could look at those guys, but for me, it's all about the pass rushers and it's all about the trenches. So if there's an elite tackle that you feel like you can take, you take him. It's never going to be a sexy pick, but you take him. And I think the guy from Utah, Spencer Fano, and Mawigoa. I got to figure out how to say his name. But you can look at one of these guys and say, hey, that would be a good fit. So if I'm the Titans and you want to build it the right way, you find yourself the best D lineman or edge rusher or the best tackle, and you draft those guys and you move forward. Even if you take a tackle and you play him at guard for a year or two as he develops, they've got some young tackles that they've drafted. You could do that. But I love the idea of looking at edge for that team. Could you get weapons and stuff for Cam Ward? Yeah. I mean, they could certainly use a running back as it shows here, and they can certainly use a wide receiver. Jeremiah Love is one of those guys that's a stud. But do you have the infrastructure in place, or would that just be another wasted season, kind of like what you got with Ashton Genty, at a position that has a pretty short shelf life in the NFL, just historically, right? Same thing looking at the Giants. I think the Giants more so got to look at offensive line more than anything. You've got to protect Jackson Dart. He hasn't proven that he can protect himself. So you've got to be able to help with protecting him as much as you possibly can. They need a lot of help at tackle. They need a lot of help on the interior of the offensive line. So other examples of what I would do to build around Jackson Dart. Wide receiver, not overly concerned, right? It shows us a need here. I don't really know why. I think he's got enough weapons around him to be successful. You got Malik Neighbors. Wan'Dale Robinson is vastly underrated. And then, you've got Theo Johnson, who I think is a nice tight end. We'll see what ends up happening with their other tight end. But ultimately, that's enough to skill position player. Scatabo looks really good. He looked really good in his rookie year before the injury. So you've got to be able to protect him or fortify your defense. That's a non-negotiable. Anything else, I think, is a bad pick. You can fill out the other positions and get some other guys later on in the draft, but with the premium picks, you don't want to miss. And I think you can find some interior linemen or a tackle or an edge rusher or an interior defensive lineman, which isn't that big of a need. But you can find really good guys at that position. And I'm always about fortifying the strengths first and then adding to a strength if you feel like you're good at those specific positions. The Browns need a quarterback. It's going to be interesting to see what they do, right? Where's Deshaun Watson in his rehab? Should he be the plan for them? No, but by signing him to a fully guaranteed contract, you kind of give him no choice. You kind of give no choice there, which is unfortunate. So we'll see what ends up ultimately happening with the Browns. But that's going to be a big one. If you don't have the answer at quarterback, you don't feel comfortable with your answer at quarterback, you've got to find one. Otherwise, I don't really know how to fix the Browns at this point. I really don't. Aside from maybe you trade Myles Garrett for an absolute haul of picks and you kind of start from the ground up. That's probably what I would do if I was a GM, as crazy as that sounds. I would really try to build this thing from the ground up and make sure that you're putting all your emphasis in as much as you can in the draft. But when you don't fire your GM and you keep John Barry, Andrew Barry, and he's been a huge problem for this franchise, a huge problem. You can't really put a lot of faith and effort into him drafting well either. So that's a big problem there. So we'll see. Washington, again, you've got your franchise quarterback. He got beat up a lot this year in Jaden Daniels. What can you do to protect him? You've got to be able to protect Jaden Daniels. Once you do that, then you can worry about everything else. You can worry about your skill position players, your running backs, all that other stuff. Protect your franchise quarterback, and then give him a defense that doesn't put all the pressure on him every single game. And so going defense or offensive line is that. As you guys can see here, there's a trend, right? And you can make the argument that it kind of goes for every single team, right? Once you get to pick 9 with the Chiefs, there you can start to get a little bit creative, right? Wide receiver would make sense for a lot of obvious reasons. A good running back, dynamic running back would make sense. But still, I would say tackle and guard is something that they need to be able to address and get better at. But essentially, it's not always about the best player. A lot of the times it's about what's the best fit for what the team needs. And that's why sometimes the teams that are drafting later in the draft, that typically are better teams, they're kind of at an advantage because you've got these teams in the they're bad teams that are picking early, that are taking a lot of the sexy picks, the fast wide receiver, the big dominant wide receiver, the stud tight end, the beastly running back. And it's allowing for other really good players to fall, and they can take it there because they have that luxury. But I think the biggest mistake in the draft for a lot of teams is that they go into it with no real plan. Because the draft, I always look at it like you got to look at the future. The only time that the future is now when it comes to the draft is finding your quarterback. If you got to take them early and you've got to take them, you got to reach for your quarterback, it's always worth it because if you hit, then the trajectory for your team becomes unlimited, right? Or you have your franchise quarterback, but you're still a really bad team. You've got to put the pieces around him, but the pieces around him start with protection, always. And it seems like a lot of teams just miss on that. Like the disservice that the Bengals have done for Joe Burrow of not really wanting to protect him with any good offensive linemen and getting him a horrifyingly bad defense is, as good as Joe Burrow is, you're just never gonna be a franchise that takes that next step, ever, right? And I fear a lot of the same things will happen with other players and other franchise quarterbacks. And then you look at a lot of the guys that had career resurgences, right? Baker Mayfield, Sam Darnold, those guys that were drafted high, did not work out, went to a couple other teams, and now they found a home with their respective teams. Sam Darnold is now with Seattle. They're the number one seed in the NFC. Baker Mayfield's had a lot of success in Tampa after, getting cut by the Browns, going to the Panthers for a little bit, then kind of having some rehab with Sean McVay before ultimately finding a home there. So all of that really could have been avoided had teams developed and built around their quarterbacks properly. The Jets didn't do that with Sam Darnold. All they did was get him killed, and they gave him nobody to throw the ball to with a bad defense. Baker Mayfield, I still don't understand why he was ever let go from Cleveland. He brought him back to the playoffs. He played really well in that playoff game against the Chiefs, but it just didn't ultimately work out. And so you think to yourself, how many of those guys would have worked out initially? How many franchises would that have changed? And how many guys are there still that are out there that, had they been given the right infrastructure, would have went out there and played well? I think that there's quite a bit of those players as well. So that's going to be the interesting thing, and that's something that I always try to keep in mind. Of like, you can make your initial rankings at each position. You can talk about making your big board, but man, the big board for my Denver Broncos versus the big board for the Tennessee Titans is vastly different. Vastly different. Last year I talked about, I loved Pat Bryant. I loved Pat Bryant for what Sean Payton and this Broncos offense is. That's why I felt like the third round pick was very justified. I'd have taken him in a second. But Pat Bryant on other teams, it might not have worked out. For other teams, it might have worked out better. Right? So that's a big thing. Is Kyle Monangai really the steal of the draft? I called him the steal of the draft when we took him when he was taken in the 7th round by the Bears. But that's such a good situation for him as well. Ben Johnson, that offense, he's kind of a 1B role, does all the little things. Well, is he ever going to be a pure workhorse? Maybe not. That was never his ceiling. But man, was he a hell of a complimentary back. And he's shown that as a complimentary back to DeAndre Swift. It would be a 2-hour-long video if I went through all of these different scenarios. I don't want to make it that. But I just wanted to make this initial introductory video on this channel to talk about what my philosophy is whenever you're going to the draft, right? Because I might have a big board that has my top 5 tight ends, but it changes very much depending on the team, the offense, the coach, the situation in which they go into. And that goes for every single player at every position in this draft. So Love to know you guys' thoughts and comments below. Thanks for tuning in, man. Let's grow this thing together. I'm really excited to start putting out more of these draft videos, to start on the rankings, to deep dive into some of the film on some of these top prospects and discussing it with you all. So appreciate you. Have a wonderful day, and we'll talk to y'all soon. Peace out.